The scorching sun of Dustwater County hammered down upon the wooden execution platform like a blacksmith's curse, and at its center stood a trembling young bride whose wrists were bound tight with rope that cut deep into tender skin, her breath shaky, her hair tangled, her eyes glassy from sleepless nights of fear, while below the gallows stood the bitter faces of her in-laws, the very family she had tried so desperately to please, now twisted with hate and greed as they hissed venomous accusations at her, crying that she had poisoned their son, stolen his wealth, tricked him into marriage for land, and whispered dark arts into his ear until sickness stole his strength. Yet the truth was far less dramatic, for the fever that had swept through the region had taken cattle, children, elders, and now him. But grief needed a villain, and she was convenient, for she was soft-spoken, kind, and without powerful relatives to defend her. And so the sheriff, pressured by the loudest voices, declared her guilty without trial, without evidence, without mercy, and the townsfolk gathered like vultures, hungry not for justice but entertainment, muttering crude judgments while children pressed forward to see her final breaths. And the old executioner prepared the lever with a grim acceptance carved into every wrinkle of his tired face. As if he had long forgotten what justice even looked like, she swallowed hard, tasting dust and despair, her heart pounding so loud she feared it would burst, and though she tried to speak, her voice broke, drowned beneath the roar of cruelty. Her mother-in-law screaming that she'd cursed their family, tearing at her own hair to show false grief, demanding the rope be pulled at once, while the father-in-law spat into the dirt, eyes cold as iron nails, and the sheriff, arms crossed, mustache drooping, gave a solemn nod that sealed her fate, commanding the executioner to pull the lever, and with that single order the world froze in awful silence, save for the rustling wind that carried distant gunshots from ranchers tending cattle, until suddenly, thunder echoed across the Main Street cobblestone, not from the sky but from hooves, powerful hooves, beating the ground like war drums. And out of the shimmering heat rode a stranger dressed in a weather-torn duster coat, boots coated in the dust of distant journeys, hat pulled low so only a sharp, steely gaze pierced through the shadow. The crowd turned, murmurs rising, whispers spreading like wildfire, because there was something unsettlingly calm about him, something that made even the sheriff straighten his spine. And without a word he tied his horse's reins to the hitching post, walked directly toward the gallows, and announced, voice low like distant thunder, that the execution must stop. The sheriff scoffed and demanded to know his business, but the stranger produced a leather satchel brimming with documents, samples and letters showing that sickness had poisoned the local well, that numerous cattle had fallen ill long before the young husband ever grew pale, and that warnings had been sent to the family advising them to burn barrels and boil water. Yet these warnings were hidden, smothered by the in-laws who wanted the land title transferred solely to them. Because if she lived, she inherited half, and if she died, all of it became theirs. But greed is a mask that hides fear, and their hands trembled as the stranger continued, revealing laboratory soil analysis, testimony from traveling doctors, and his own sworn statement that he had personally delivered warnings weeks before the young husband's fever, making it impossible for blame to rest on her. The crowd gasped, voices rising, doubt spreading like ink spilled across canvas, townsfolk stepping back from the hateful family as if corruption might stain their boots. But the in-laws shrieked louder, claiming forgery, accusing bribery, and trying to tear the satchel from the sheriff's hands. Yet the stranger's presence was immovable, his posture radiating strength, his eyes cold with righteous fury, and as the sheriff skimmed the documents, his cheeks drained of color, sweat trickling down his brow, realization sinking deep like a dagger. He had nearly hanged an innocent woman because he feared the political weight of a bitter, wealthy family. Slowly, reluctantly, he motioned for the executioner to release her. But before the rope could be loosened, the mother-in-law lunged, shrieking accusations, trying to shove the executioner aside and pull the lever herself, only to be restrained by deputies who rolled their eyes at her hysteria, binding her wrists as she screamed and kicked, while the father-in-law slumped, defeated, muttering curses under his breath. The crowd, once drunk on judgment, now whispered in shame, averting their eyes, unable to meet the stare of the woman they had condemned without thought. And as she was freed from the noose, her legs buckled, tears flooding down cheeks stained with dust, and she nearly collapsed. But the stranger caught her, firm, steady, respectful, shielding her from prying eyes and hateful whispers, and though she tried to speak, gratitude choked in her throat, replaced by stunned silence. He guided her gently down the steps, escorting her through a crowd that parted like storm clouds under lightning. But not everyone approved, for a few men spat at the ground, muttering that women should know their place. Yet others, mostly younger cowboys, drifters, and mothers clutching little ones, glared at the bigots, whispering that it could have been any of them atop that platform, victims of rumor and fear. Once outside the courthouse fence, the stranger offered to escort her somewhere safe, explaining that families wicked enough to kill through lies would not hesitate to try again in the shadows, their greed too heavy to release so easily. So they rode to his ranch, a sprawling stretch of land nestled between red cliffs and whispering pines, horses grazing peacefully, rivers glistening like melted stars, and cabins warmed by crackling hearths. And though she felt guilty for intruding, his ranch hands welcomed her with quiet nods, offering blankets, fresh water, and a place to sit, their eyes filled with sympathy. For word had spread quickly through rancher channels, and many had suspected the in-laws long before evidence surfaced. Days passed, and as her strength returned, she helped feed horses, mend fences, tend flowers, and though fear weighed heavily upon her heart, hope bloomed like stubborn wildflowers between the cracks of trauma. The stranger trained her to shoot, to ride confidently, to stand tall before bullies, whispering truths that hardened her spine like tempered steel, reminding her that no one has the right to dictate her worth or steal her voice. But eventually the law caught up to her in-laws, who were arrested for evidence suppression, attempted murder, land fraud, and violent assault, their faces contorted with disbelief. And as townsfolk watched them hauled away, the same mouths that once spit judgment now cheered for justice, though the cheers did little to erase the scars she carried. Yet through time, the stranger's quiet strength anchored her trembling spirit, and she grew to walk without shrinking, to speak without whispering, and to live without fearing rope-wielding hands. Months later, she stood upon that same gallows, not as victim, but as survivor, addressing a crowd assembled for a gathering of landowners and sheriff deputies, her voice powerful, declaring that rumors can kill faster than bullets, that greed blinds hearts, that every soul deserves fair trial, and that communities must stand against tyranny cloaked as grief. The applause thundered across the plains, echoing off canyon walls. And though she never asked for revenge, justice arrived like sunrise after a storm. And as she descended the steps, heart swelling with pride, the stranger approached, tipping his hat, voice warm with unspoken admiration, and proposed that she stay on the ranch as partner, equal in ownership and responsibility, reminding her she no longer needed to navigate a cruel world alone. She smiled, tears shimmering, nodding with faith reborn, and the ranch flourished under their shared leadership, becoming refuge for widows, orphans, displaced wanderers, and battered souls, rising into legend whispered across dusty trails. So, dear viewers, if this tale stirred your heart, if injustice made your fists clench and triumph made your spirit soar, then hit subscribe. Because there are countless stories of courage, redemption, and truth waiting to be told. And by joining this community, you ensure more voices rise from the gallows of silence. So subscribe now, share the channel, and help this frontier of storytelling continue riding into the sunset of victory together.